The walk home, shadows in suburbia. The day had already stretched Elijah Brooks thin. 16 years old and carrying the dreams of 1,000 tomorrows on his shoulders, he had left the Franklin High basketball gym only a short while ago, muscles aching, jersey damp with sweat, and heart filled with that tired satisfaction that comes from pushing past his limits. For him, the gym was more than just hardwood floors and squeaky sneakers. It was a sanctuary, a place where the rhythm of dribbles and the echo of shouts erased the worries of the outside world. His coaches told him he had promise. His teammates relied on his calm leadership, and his mother reminded him every night that greatness was built on persistence. But now, walking out into the cool Ohio evening, the fading warmth of the sun falling across his dark skin, Elijah just wanted to go home, take a long shower, and sit down for the dinner his mom always made sure was waiting. The shortcut through Brookstone Estates promised him 20 minutes less walking, and after hours of drills, layups, and scrimmages, 20 minutes meant the world. It was not his first time passing through Brookstone. His best friend Jordan lived there, and more than once he had crashed on Jordan's couch, eaten at his family's polished oak dinner table, and even joined the neighborhood kids for late-night video games. But still, walking here alone was different. Alone, he was no one's guest, no one's friend from school. Alone, he was just himself, a black teenager moving through an enclave of white fences, red brick facades, and tightly trimmed lawns. Alone, he was vulnerable to how people chose to see him. The neighborhood was eerily beautiful, the kind of beauty that felt curated, artificial, as though every tree had been measured, every flower bed arranged under committee approval. The sidewalks stretched clean and wide. The houses stood tall and dignified with gleaming windows that caught the last blush of sunset, and the air carried the mingled scents of grilled steak, baked bread, and expensive perfumes wafting from open dining rooms. Families were settling in for the evening, their children's laughter ringing faintly through the glass walls of modern living rooms, their SUVs tucked neatly into driveways that seemed designed for glossy magazine covers. On the surface, it was the picture of perfection. Yet Elijah, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag, felt the prickle of unease crawl slowly up his neck. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe it was the loneliness of walking without a friend by his side, or maybe, just maybe, it was the eyes. The feeling of being watched, judged, sized up by glances behind curtains and from porches where neighbors paused their conversations mid-sentence to make sure they weren't imagining the figure of a tall, broad-shouldered teenager striding through their sanctuary. He pulled his earbuds free, letting the music fade away because something inside told him to stay alert, to keep his ears open, as if the very air was shifting in anticipation of something unseen. From the window of her velvet-draped sitting room, Linda Cartwright clutched her teacup a little tighter than usual. 15 years she had lived in Brookstone Estates, 15 years of calm order, where she knew every jogger, every dog walker, every delivery driver, even the high school kids who cut across the cul-de-sac on their way to the park. She prided herself on vigilance, on paying attention, on never being the neighbor who said I had no idea after something went wrong. And now her eyes narrowed at the sight of the stranger pacing the sidewalk, a tall, athletic boy, dark-skinned, carrying a bag that seemed too heavy, walking with a stride too purposeful. She could not place his face among the family she knew, and the fact alone unsettled her. He looked around occasionally, not nervously, but with a scanning awareness, and in her mind that single detail became loaded with meaning. He wasn't strolling casually like the carefree children of the neighborhood. He wasn't pausing to admire the landscaping or wave at passing neighbors. He was moving with intent. He was studying. Her heart picked up, a whisper in her mind, warning her that this was how it always began. The news stories she read, the accounts of neighborhoods robbed, homes invaded, families blindsided. Always someone noticed something but dismissed it. Always someone thought, it's probably nothing, until the police reports came and regret was too late to matter. Her gaze slipped to the phone beside her. She could ignore it, sip her tea, wait for the boy to pass, or she could act, make the call, ensure safety, remove doubt. She thought of her grandchildren visiting on weekends, of her husband working late shifts, of the trust this neighborhood had in itself to stay protected. Better safe than sorry, she told herself, even as a tiny seed of doubt whispered that the boy might just be another student on his way home. She silenced the whisper. Her fingers dialed quickly. 911, she breathed. I want to report a suspicious person in Brookstone Estates. The call that spilled from her lips was calm, precise and rooted in fear masquerading as civic duty. She described the teenager's dark skin first, his bag second, his supposed behavior third. She left out the part about how he had done nothing wrong, how he had not so much as stepped onto a lawn or slowed his stride to eye a house. The dispatcher pressed for details. Had he threatened anyone, tried to break in, carried a weapon? Linda faltered but pushed forward. No, not yet. But it looks like he could be casing the homes. The dispatcher promised a patrol car would check the situation. Relief swelled through her chest as she hung up. She had done her part, she thought. She had been vigilant. She had preserved Brookstone's peace. Yet even as she picked up her tea again, she noticed her hands trembling, her reflection in the glossy surface of the window looking less like a protector and more like someone staring into the face of her own prejudice. She ignored it. The sirens would come soon, and they would sort it out. They always did. Elijah, meanwhile, reached the corner of Oak Ridge Lane when he heard it, the faint, distant cry of a siren cutting through the evening air. His stomach clenched instinctively, a heaviness pooling in his chest. He slowed, glanced behind him, and saw the flicker of red and blue lights bouncing against the manicured hedges and polished garage doors. For a fleeting moment, he told himself it couldn't be about him. He hadn't done anything wrong, he was just walking home. But the car slowed as it approached, the siren cutting short into a burst of silence that felt heavier than the sound itself. The cruiser stopped against the curb, tires crunching softly on the immaculate asphalt, and two figures emerged, one older, with a hardened expression carved by years on the force, the other younger, his face still carrying the softness of inexperience. Their hands hovered near their belts, their eyes locked on him with suspicion that stung deeper than any insult ever could. Elijah swallowed, tightening his grip on the strap of his duffel bag, forcing himself to stand tall even as every instinct screamed at him to run. But running would only make it worse. Running would transform suspicion into guilt. Running would write a narrative he didn't deserve. So he stayed rooted, his pulse hammering, his breath caught between courage and fear. The world had shifted in a matter of minutes. One moment he was just a boy walking home, dreaming about dinner and the game highlights he'd watch with his mom. The next, he was a suspect under the burning gaze of authority, his innocence buried under assumptions he could not control. And, somewhere behind a curtain and a cold cup of tea, a woman who didn't know him at all sat believing she had saved her neighborhood, never realizing she had just endangered his life. This was how it began, the kind of moment that would echo for years, not just in Elijah's memory, but in the conscience of a community forced to confront the fragile line between safety and suspicion, vigilance and prejudice, fear and justice. The night was only just beginning, but already its weight pressed heavily on every breath Elijah took. The police confrontation, innocence on trial. The cruiser's doors shut with a heavy thud that seemed to echo louder than the distant hum of sprinklers and the faint chorus of cicadas. Elijah stood still, his back straight, but his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his duffel bag sagging with the weight of sweat-soaked jerseys and worn-out sneakers. Two officers advanced toward him, their shadows stretching across the sidewalk, the flashing red and blue lights painting his face in alternating bursts of color that made the whole scene feel unreal, as though he had stepped into a nightmare someone else had scripted. The older officer, with a rigid frame and lines etched deep into his jaw, led the way. His boots struck the pavement in deliberate rhythm, a cadence that carried unspoken authority. His partner, younger, less sure, trailed slightly behind, his eyes flickering with caution, curiosity, and maybe even doubt. But together they moved like a wall, their presence pressing against Elijah until the simple act of breathing felt like defiance. "Stop right there," the older officer barked, though Elijah had already stopped, his sneakers planted firmly on the concrete. The words were unnecessary, but they weren't meant to direct. They were meant to dominate. Elijah's throat tightened, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to meet the officer's eyes. He had grown up hearing stories, watching news clips, memorizing advice his mother drilled into him. Keep your voice calm, don't reach suddenly. Yes sir, no sir, don't give them a reason. He swallowed, adjusted the strap of his duffel bag slightly and nodded. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly, the steadiness in his voice disguising the storm inside. The younger officer's hand hovered near his holster, though it never fully gripped the weapon. His eyes darted to the bag hanging from Elijah's shoulder, and in that glance Elijah saw it, the suspicion, the assumption, the silent question of what could be hidden inside. What are you doing here? The older officer demanded, his voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. Elijah shifted slightly, choosing his words carefully. I'm just walking home. I live a few blocks away. His words carried no tremor, yet each one felt like it had to fight to escape the weight pressing down on him. The older officer's smirk was small but sharp, a flicker of skepticism that dismissed Elijah's explanation before it was even finished. A few blocks away, huh? That's convenient, he muttered. You don't live in this neighborhood, so why here? Why this route? Elijah opened his mouth, then paused. How could he explain something as simple as exhaustion, as human as wanting to shave 20 minutes off his walk after practice? How could he say it in a way that wouldn't sound like an excuse to ears already tuned to disbelief? It's a shortcut, he replied finally, his voice steady but his chest tightening, with frustration. My best friend lives here. I've been through before. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Before the conversation could breathe, the younger officer moved. In a swift motion that startled Elijah's already frayed nerves, he reached forward and gripped the strap of the duffel bag. Elijah stiffened, instinctively pulling back a little, but the officer tugged it free with firm insistence. We'll just check this out, he said, his voice lower, less aggressive, but still carrying the authority of someone who believed they had the right to pry. The bag landed on the hood of the cruiser with a dull thump. The zipper peeled back under the officer's hands, revealing the contents. A pair of worn basketball sneakers with scuffed soles, a damp jersey that still smelled faintly of sweat, and hardwood polish, a half-empty water bottle, a notebook filled with practice drills and scrawled motivational quotes his coach had given him. Innocence lay bare under the neon glow of the patrol lights, yet it did not seem to loosen the older officer's hardened gaze. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. The younger officer glanced at his partner as, if silently asking whether this was enough, whether they should close the bag, apologize, let the boy go. But the older officer only stepped closer, his boots crunching on the sidewalk, his presence towering over Elijah. Why were you looking around? He asked, his tone sharp, accusatory. You walking fast, checking houses. You think that doesn't look suspicious? Elijah's chest rose and fell with deep, deliberate breaths. He wanted to say he wasn't checking houses, that he was only glancing around because he felt watched, because the whole neighborhood's eyes seemed to burn through him. He wanted to shout that the only reason they were even talking to him was because someone had called, not because he had done anything wrong. But he swallowed it all down, his mother's voice in his memory reminding him, control the fire, or the fire will control you. So he answered with restraint, each word a careful stone laid on unstable ground. I was just walking. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just walking. The younger officer's face shifted, a flicker of unease passing through his eyes, but the older officer's expression did not waver. He leaned closer, his shadow stretching across Elijah's face, the faint smell of aftershave and leather mixing with the heavy weight of his authority. You expect me to believe that? He said, his voice quiet but laced with challenge. Elijah met his gaze, his own voice firm but calm. It's the truth. For a brief moment the air seemed to crackle, the thin thread between escalation and resolution pulled taut. One wrong move, one raised voice, one flinch could snap it and spiral the night into tragedy. The silence was broken only by the distant murmur of a TV playing inside one of the houses, laughter spilling faintly through the glass windows of a world oblivious to the tension brewing just outside. Elijah stood there, his dignity bruised but unbroken, while the officers hovered, their suspicion refusing to dissipate even in the face of evidence. He was no longer simply a boy walking home. He had been transformed, in their eyes, into a figure who needed to explain his existence to justify his presence, to prove that he belonged on the very sidewalk his feet carried him across. The injustice of it all pressed heavy against his chest, but he held it in, clinging to composure, waiting for something, anything, that might break the cycle of assumption closing in around him. The night felt endless, the flashing lights eternal, the weight of suspicion infinite. But somewhere in the distance an engine's low growl approached, steady and deliberate, carrying with it the shift neither officer nor Elijah yet understood. The confrontation was far from over. It was only teetering at its edge, waiting for the balance to tip. The arrival. A mother's power. The tension on that sidewalk had grown so thick it seemed to cling to Elijah's skin, pressing against his chest with every breath. The officers stood fixed in their postures, one gripping suspicion like a shield, the other hesitating but unwilling to break rank. Elijah's duffel bag sat open on the cruiser's hood, his life reduced to sneakers, sweat, and scraps of paper, and still the weight of their eyes told him it wasn't enough to clear him. He could feel the air vibrating with the possibility of something worse, a powder keg waiting for the smallest spark. Then from down the street a new sound arrived. Not the erratic scream of sirens, but the smooth, confident hum of a vehicle that carried none of the nervous energy of the patrol car. Its headlights cut through the twilight, bright but steady, and the deep purr of its engine seemed to announce something that the officers didn't yet understand, but Elijah recognized instantly. His chest tightened, but this time with relief. He knew that sound. He knew who it belonged to. The black SUV glided into view, its polished frame reflecting the red and blue strobe of the cruiser's lights in fleeting streaks of color. It rolled to a controlled stop at the curb, the kind of stop that didn't waste movement, the kind that declared purpose without apology. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. The officers turned, eyebrows furrowing, their stance subtly shifting as the door opened. And then she stepped out. Denise Brooks, Elijah's mother, carried herself with the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime walking into rooms where power and danger mingled and never once bowing her head. Her heels struck the pavement with crisp finality, each step echoing like a metronome of authority. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She walked, with the deliberate grace of someone who knew time was her ally, not her enemy. Her tailored suit jacket caught the evening breeze, her badge tucked away, but her presence radiating something even stronger. The unspoken command of a woman who understood the language of control far better than the men standing across from her. Elijah felt his throat loosen as he watched her approach, relief flooding him like cool water after being scorched too long in the sun. But he also felt a flicker of worry, because he knew his mother. He knew the steel in her eyes, the way her voice could slice through arrogance without ever rising in volume. He knew that when she stood before those officers, they would see more than a mother. They would see a force that unsettled the very foundation of their authority. The older officer, Bennett, though Elijah didn't yet know his name, straightened his shoulders, masking his flicker of uncertainty with hardened resolve. He wasn't the kind of man to give ground easily. His younger partner shifted slightly, sensing the shift in atmosphere but unsure how to respond. Denise closed the distance, her gaze sweeping over the scene in one unbroken line of analysis. She saw everything: the open bag, the way one officer's hand still hovered too close to his holster, the tautness in her son's posture that betrayed how close he was to unraveling, and the silent neighborhood that framed the tableau with windows watching but curtains drawn tight. In a single glance she understood it all, and her fury flared hot inside her chest. But she didn't show it. Fury was useless if it wasn't controlled. She had been trained for moments exactly like this, moments when composure was the sharpest weapon. What's going on here? Her voice wasn't loud, yet it cut through the tension like glass shattering on marble. The syllables carried calm precision, but beneath the calm was an edge so sharp, the officers instinctively braced. Rodriguez, the younger one, opened his mouth, but Bennett spoke first, his tone clipped, rehearsed, and defensive. "We got a call about a suspicious person in the area. We're verifying his story." Denise stopped just a step away from Elijah, placing herself deliberately between her son and the men who thought they had power over him. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking on Bennett's without wavering. "Suspicious person," she repeated, the words tasting like poison she refused to swallow. "Suspicious in what way?" Bennett hesitated, the pause betraying cracks in his certainty. But he recovered quickly, gesturing toward the bag now sprawled across his cruiser. He was carrying a bag, moving quickly, looking around at the houses. "That's unusual in this neighborhood." Denise let the silence stretch for a moment, her gaze unwavering, her breath steady. Then she turned, her voice softening slightly as she addressed her son, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted every syllable to ring clear in the air for the officers to hear. "Elijah," she said, her tone firm but filled with an undercurrent of warmth. "What's in your bag?" Elijah's voice carried both relief and exhaustion. "My basketball gear, Mom. Shoes, jersey, water bottle." Denise nodded once, then turned back to the officers, her expression cold as stone. "That's what he told you, isn't it? So why are you still holding his belongings like they're evidence of a crime?" Rodriguez flinched slightly, guilt flickering across his face, but Bennett stood rigid, refusing to yield. Denise took one more step forward, her voice dropping lower, more deliberate. "You said you got a call about a suspicious person. Fine. But let me ask you something. Does being a 16-year-old boy carrying a gym bag after practice make him suspicious? Or is it that you got a call from someone who looked out their window, saw his skin color, and decided he didn't belong here?" The question hung heavy in the air, heavier than the flashing lights, heavier than the silence of the watching houses. Rodriguez looked down, his jaw tightening as if wrestling with his conscience. Bennett's lips pressed thin, his eyes hardening. But even he couldn't summon a response that didn't collapse under the weight of the truth. Denise let the silence do its work. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the sharpest scalpel. It forced people to face themselves, to sit with the ugliness they wanted to ignore. Then slowly, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped a few times with unhurried precision. She held the screen up, her hand steady as steel. "This is my son," she said, her voice still calm, but now threaded with something undeniable. "This is his student ID. This is our address. We live 3 blocks from here. He is not suspicious. He is not a criminal. He doesn't have to prove anything to you. Not tonight. Not ever." The street seemed to hold its breath. Elijah felt the knot in his chest loosen as he watched his mother stand like an unshakable wall between him and the men who had tried to reduce him to a threat. For the first time that night, he felt the balance shift, the crushing weight of suspicion lifting from his shoulders and settling instead into the silence of the officers who now had no ground to stand on. Denise's presence had turned the script inside out. What had begun as an interrogation was now a reckoning, and though the confrontation wasn't over, one truth had already become undeniable. They were no longer in control. The truth revealed, collar exposed. For a long moment, silence ruled the street. The red and blue lights flickered across brick walls and polished garage doors, bouncing off the glossy paint of parked cars like the heartbeat of a neighborhood that wanted desperately to pretend it was still untouched. Rodriguez shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his unease painted plainly across his face while Bennett's jaw clenched, his pride stiffening into defiance he couldn't justify. Elijah stood a step behind his mother, the tension in his shoulders finally loosening, though his eyes remained sharp, watching, memorizing, absorbing the moment that was searing itself into his memory. Denise remained still, her phone screen glowing faintly as though illuminating the obvious truth that neither officer wanted to say aloud. Then, just as the silence began to stretch too long, a sound cracked it open. The squeak of a front door, hinge, hesitant but deliberate. Across the street, a figure appeared in the glow of a porch light. Linda Cartwright stepped out from the threshold of her 2-story home, her pale face illuminated in the flickering strobe of the cruiser's lights. She clutched the edge of her doorframe for a second, her teacup long abandoned inside, her expression twisted between curiosity guilt and the fragile bravado of someone trying to convince themselves they had acted rightly. For years she had prided herself on vigilance, on being the neighbor who noticed everything. But now, as she looked across at the sight she had set in motion, the teenager standing with his belongings laid bare, the officers cornered by questions they couldn't answer, and the woman who radiated authority like a storm held in human form, something in her stomach twisted. She had thought calling would protect her neighborhood, her family, her sense of safety. Instead, she was confronted with the undeniable truth of what she had done. She had taken a boys' evening and turned it into a battlefield. Denise's eyes lifted, catching Linda's figure in an instant. Their gazes locked across the asphalt, across the flickering light, across the invisible line that separated those who believed they belonged and those who were told they did not. For a breathless moment, no one else existed. Two women, strangers in every sense but bound now by the consequences of one phone call, stood in silent confrontation. Linda wanted to look away, to retreat back into her perfect house with its cream-colored chairs and untouched teacups, but she couldn't. Denise's gaze pinned her like a nail through fragile glass, sharp and unyielding. When Denise finally spoke, her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. It carried across the street with the precision of a blade, each word crafted to leave no room for misunderstanding. "Was it you?" she asked, not as an accusation, but as a fact already known. Linda's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her throat tightened under the weight of exposure. She wanted to say something, anything, to explain that she had only been trying to be careful, that she had misread the situation, that she wasn't a bad person. The excuses rushed through her mind, each one collapsing before it reached her tongue. Because the truth was too obvious. She hadn't seen a boy carrying his gym bag home. She had seen his skin, his presence, his difference, and fear had dressed it up as vigilance. Denise didn't look away, didn't give her the mercy of escape. She continued, her tone calm but laced with steel. "You looked out your window and saw my son. You didn't see his bag, his sweat, his tired feet from practice. You didn't see the student, the athlete, the child. You saw what you wanted to see. And in that choice you almost turned my son into another headline." The words struck like hammers against the fragile wall Linda had built around her conscience. She opened her mouth again, but only managed a whisper. I was just trying to be safe. I didn't mean safe for who? Denise's question cut through her excuse before it could find ground. Safe for the people who look like you? Safe for the ones you've already decided belong here? You called the police not because of what he did, but because of who he is. Do you understand what could have happened? Do you understand how quickly this could have ended in something you couldn't take back? Denise's voice sharpened now, but it still didn't rise. She had learned long ago that true power wasn't in shouting. It was in making every syllable impossible to ignore. Rodriguez looked down, shame flickering in his features, while Bennett shifted uncomfortably, his posture no longer carrying the same iron authority it had minutes before. The weight of Denise's words wasn't just for Linda. It was for them, too. The silent truth that suspicion without cause was nothing more than prejudice wrapped in uniform. The neighborhood, still hidden behind blinds and curtains, listened, in silence, the air heavy with the realization that their sanctuary wasn't as untouchable as they wanted to believe. Linda's knees felt weak. For the first time, she saw not just Elijah but her own reflection in this moment. The reflection of fear twisted into harm. She wanted desperately to justify herself, to paint herself as cautious rather than cruel. But standing under Denise's gaze, she knew no words could erase the damage she had caused. Her silence was louder than any excuse, and in that silence her neighbors, whether watching or pretending not to, would see her as the source of this chaos. Denise finally shifted her stance, her hand resting gently on Elijah's shoulder, steadying him not because he was weak, but because she wanted him to feel in every fiber of his being that he was not alone. She turned back to the officers, her eyes narrowing once more. If you don't have a valid reason to be here, then you're done. My son is going home. And you... She glanced back at Linda, her voice lowering into a cold finality. You can live with the weight of knowing that your fear nearly destroyed a boy's evening, his dignity, maybe even his life. Next time you look out your window, I hope you see people, not shadows. The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, the kind that lingers and clings no matter how much one tries to wave it away. Linda felt the chill of them seep into her bones, her mouth dry, her hands trembling. Across the street, Elijah stood taller, his mother beside him, and for the first time that night the balance of power was clear. The danger wasn't in the boy walking home. The danger had been in the assumptions that sought to strip him of his humanity. And now, laid bare under the streetlights, that truth could not be hidden again. The lesson: strength, justice, and change. The street was still cloaked in silence, but it was no longer the uneasy silence of suspicion. It was the heavy, undeniable silence of truth that could not be ignored. The flashing lights from the cruiser still pulsed against the facades of the neat red brick houses, but their power had dimmed, stripped of authority by a mother's presence that was stronger than any badge that night. Denise's hand remained, firm on Elijah's shoulder, not clutching in fear but grounding him in strength, reminding him that no matter how the world tried to reduce him, his identity, his dignity, and his worth were not negotiable. Elijah stood taller than he had at the beginning of the confrontation, his chest rising steadily as if he was breathing for the first time since the patrol car pulled up behind him. The officers shifted awkwardly, their posture no longer dominating the scene. Rodriguez's eyes flickered with the weight of shame, his youth betraying the fact that he had not yet learned how to bury conscience completely under procedure. Bennett, older and hardened, clung to his pride, but even he could not summon the same force he carried when he first stepped out of the cruiser. His authority had been pierced, not with aggression but with facts he could not refute and a presence he could not overpower. The neighborhood watched from behind glass windows and partially drawn blinds, their silence complicit yet also telling. They had witnessed the unfolding of something that would echo long after the cruiser's lights faded. Some would go to bed unsettled, realizing for the first time that their perfect cul-de-sacs and pristine lawns were not immune to the ugly truths of bias and prejudice. Others would cling to excuses, telling themselves that Linda had only been cautious, that the police had only been doing their jobs, that nothing had really happened. But no matter how they tried to spin it in their minds, the image remained, burned into their memory. A boy stopped and interrogated for the crime of existing where someone thought he didn't belong, and a mother standing like an unmovable wall until the truth shattered the fragile illusion of safety built on fear. Denise turned her gaze back to the officers, her voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority that belonged to someone who had seen the worst of the world and chosen to stand against it. "This stop is over," she said, her words steady, her tone final. "My son has told you who he is. You've seen his belongings. You have no further reason to detain him. If you want to keep pressing, I suggest you remember who you are speaking to." The subtle edge in her words reminded them of what they hadn't yet realized, that this wasn't just a protective mother speaking. This was an FBI agent, a woman whose badge carried a weight even heavier than theirs. Bennett's lips tightened, his pride bristling at the idea of retreat, but deep down he knew there was nothing left to justify his presence. Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. We're clear here." He closed the duffel bag, slid it back toward Elijah, and for a moment his eyes met the boy's. It wasn't an apology spoken aloud, but the flicker of guilt said what his mouth did not. Elijah lifted the bag onto his shoulder again, the simple act carrying the dignity of reclaiming what had been stripped from him. Denise nodded once, her gaze never leaving the officers until they stepped back toward the cruiser. The flashing lights dimmed as the engine rumbled to life, the patrol car pulling slowly away, its presence shrinking into the distance until the street was returned to the quiet rhythm of evening once more. But the silence that followed was different now, charged, heavy, and unforgettable. Across the street, Linda still stood frozen in her doorway, her hands gripping the frame as if the wood could steady the storm inside her. She had expected the police to validate her fears, to pat her on the back for her vigilance, to assure her she had done the right thing. Instead, she stood exposed under the gaze of the very woman her call had endangered, her excuses shriveling before they could form. Denise glanced at her once more, her eyes sharp but not cruel. There was no need for cruelty. The truth had already cut deep enough. "This could have ended differently," she said, her voice low but carrying effortlessly across the space between them. "Next time you let fear guide your choices, remember what almost happened tonight. Remember who could have been lost." And with that, she turned away, guiding her son gently toward the SUV. As they walked, Elijah finally found his voice, quiet but steady. "Mom," he said, glancing up at her. "Were you scared?" Denise paused, her heels clicking softly against the pavement before she answered. "Yes," she admitted, honesty lacing her words. "But fear isn't what defines us. It's what we choose to do in the face of it. And tonight, we chose to stand." Elijah absorbed her words, the lesson etching itself into his memory with more permanence than any textbook or lecture could provide. For the rest of his life, he would carry not only the weight of what almost happened, but also the unshakable truth of how his mother stood between him and injustice, how she turned fear into accountability and silence into strength. They reached the SUV and Denise opened the door, allowing Elijah to climb in before taking one last glance at the street. The houses stood still, their lights glowing warmly as if untouched. But she knew better. The veneer of perfection had cracked. And though some would try to seal it back with denial, others would never forget the fracture they had witnessed. She hoped, in that quiet way one hopes for change, that tonight had planted something in at least one heart, a seed of recognition, of humility, of courage to act differently the next time they felt fear, whispering lies about who belonged and who did not. As the SUV pulled away, the world around them seemed to exhale, the tension bleeding back into the shadows. Elijah leaned his head against the window, his bag resting at his feet, his eyes heavy not with exhaustion from basketball practice but with the weight of the evening's lesson. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a witness to truth, a keeper of memory, a reminder of resilience. Denise's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes sharp on the road ahead. She knew this would not be the last time her son faced suspicion, but she also knew he now carried the strength of this night, the knowledge that he was not alone, that his worth was not up for debate. And somewhere behind them, Linda Cartwright closed her door, retreating into her home. But no matter how many times she replayed the moment in her mind, she could not escape the truth that stood unshakable against her fear. For the rest of her days in Brookstone Estates, every time she saw a boy walking down her street, she would remember the night she called the police on innocence and found herself staring into the eyes of a mother who refused to let fear win. That was the lesson, the truth that could not be erased. Safety built on suspicion was no safety at all. Dignity could not be borrowed or denied, and strength was not in those who shouted the loudest or carried badges on their belts, but in those who stood unshaken when justice demanded a voice. Elijah and Denise carried that lesson home with them, and the neighborhood, whether it admitted it or not, carried it too. For the first time in a long time, Brookstone's silence was no longer comfort. It was conscience.